Shalom, welcome to the Jewish View. My name is Rabbi Nachman Simon with the Chabad House of Delmar, together with my co-host Mark Ronan of Statewide News Service and jbizdickphilly.com, and now the new columnist for the Jewish Press.
Right, and I'm having a lot of fun writing that column because we talk about how government relates to the Jewish community. So, hopefully that'll be an interesting. I'll be able to do it for a long time. Excellent. And now we have a special guest with us today. I'm sure, Rabbi, you've heard of the Alzheimer's Association.
Right.
Well, we have the executive director and the chief executive officer of the Alzheimer's Association of the Northeastern New York chapter, Elizabeth Smith-Boivin. And welcome to the Jewish View.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I just want to start off. Everybody knows I'm 29 years old, but when we were kids, you never heard of Alzheimer's. And then now it's like Mark says, everybody's heard of it. We shouldn't, right. The Jewish way is you should know from it. That's the give a blessing. We shouldn't have this terrible, terrible condition. Right. But, just tell us a little bit the history of all of a sudden it's Alzheimer's. Mm-hmm. You hear about it and it's terrible and so many people have it.
And how is it different from dementia?
Okay. Also? So we'll start by saying you're right. When we were kids, we didn't hear much about it, but we used to call what we now call Alzheimer's disease senility often, or we said that people had chronic organic brain syndrome. So we probably called this disease many different things, and none of the titles were probably correct, because actually the disease was identified in 1906 by Dr. Alois Alzheimer, who's a German scientist.
That's who it's named after.
Yes, that's who it's named after. And he identified it in the brain of a woman who was 51 years old. And so for many, many years, in all of his early writings, in early neurology textbooks, psychiatry textbooks, you will find the definition of Alzheimer's disease really reserved for people who are in that age group, in their 50s. And then what happened was in the late 1970s and early 1980s, particularly in the United States, we began to do more and more autopsy work on people who were dying with conditions that looked like Dr. Alzheimer described. And indeed, neuropathologists were finding these hallmark signs of Alzheimer's disease. In 1984, Newsweek featured Alzheimer's on its first cover. And then we realized that we were probably incorrectly labeling many different conditions for many, many years. So part of the huge rise
being just generally senility, any person says senile, oh, you have Alzheimer's?
No, definitely not. But what we did now is we're more accurate at making a diagnosis. So number one, we're more accurate at making a diagnosis, so we're properly calling Alzheimer's disease. And number two, the greatest risk factor for developing Alzheimer's disease is age. And so as we continue to see large numbers of increases in the oldest populations, we're going to see a rise in all conditions that affect older people. And so now we know, for example, that 1 out of 2 Americans over the age of 85 develop Alzheimer's disease.
Really, that many?
That many.
I didn't think that.
And so years ago, not that many people lived to be over 85. Right. Nowadays, there are people living to be over 85 all of the time.
Centenarians.
Exactly.
And, more than ever. Yeah.
And to your question, Mark, which is a question we're asked all the time, how do you separate Alzheimer's disease from dementia and also senility? So senility simply means aging. And we know that as we age, a lot of things don't work the way they used to.
Including your brain.
Including your brain, that's right. So memory is one of those things. But we do have parameters for normal aging memory. And when you move past the area of normal aging memory, you move into an area, a category that we call dementia. But dementia is not the disease in and of itself. It's rather a list of symptoms or syndromes. And you can have dementia for many different reasons. Some people have Parkinson's type dementia. Some people develop dementia because they have a brain tumor or a metabolic deficiency. However, Alzheimer's disease is the number one type of dementia.
Oh, I see.
So the connection between Alzheimer's and dementia is much like saying lymphoma is a type of cancer. Mm-hmm. Alzheimer's disease is a type of dementia.
Okay. And how did you get involved in this whole, this whole subject matter? I mean, where did you go to school and what did you study, and did that all develop into this?
Yes, it did. I went to Siena College for my undergraduate work, and I majored in social work. And my first real job was really at the Good Samaritan Nursing Home in Del Mar, where I was a social worker. And what struck me was the number of families that I met in the course of my work there who had taken on a caregiving role for a person with Alzheimer's disease. And their stories touched me so much, I wanted to learn more about the disease. Well, this was in the early 80s when there weren't many resources around, but there was this new young fledgling organization called the Alzheimer's Association. And so I became a member, and then I joined the Speakers Bureau, and then I joined their board of directors. And so for over 30 years, I've been a volunteer in some capacity with the Alzheimer's Association, and then also done my professional work in the area of Alzheimer's disease. And so 2.5 years ago, when the position of executive director CEO became open at the local chapter, I said, you know what? After 30 years of being a part of this association in some way, I would love to throw my hat in the ring, if you will. And so I'm very proud to be the executive director.
And tell us about your experience at Albany Med.
For 10 years prior to this job, I was the director of the Alzheimer's Center at Albany Med. And that particular center does a lot of diagnostic work as well as research and care consultation and care management, which overlaps a little bit with the role that we have at the Alzheimer's Association as well.
So how did that experience enrich you? I mean, because it's a very depressing topic when you see these once vital people now just winnowing away and their whole life is just escaping them, but their shell is there, and just seems depressing. But you seem not to get down, when you see this. So.
Sometimes I do. I mean, sometimes we have, days in the office that are very sad. We have, unique or unusual cases. Every case of Alzheimer's disease is sad. Some are harder than others. When we have a call from a family in their 40s or in their 50s, which is unusual, but it does happen. And the impact on a younger family, of course, is that much greater than it is on another family. Or we'll have a call from a spouse who's been married for, 50 years or 60 years, and they're really struggling with their loved one's illness. Those are all hard days. What I've enjoyed about this work for so many years is the fact that I believe every day we help somebody on this difficult journey. And so while the work is hard sometimes, the number of calls and thank you notes we get from families that say, you helped me make a connection, you helped me keep my husband at home. If we're able to help somebody in the face of adversity, I guess that's what keeps us moving forward.
What you were saying, I'm worried about prevention. Just saying 1 out of 2 is just, and of course, everybody knows people are living so much older.
Sure.
And is there any way to prevent, or it's just old age, it's inevitable, and 1 out of 2, you're going to get it.
Well,
is there any research in that area?
There is a lot of research in that area, and that's a great question. Right now, we can't use the word prevention in Alzheimer's disease because we don't have preventions. However, it certainly is our goal, and we have many things that we can do to reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease. So while we say that 49% or 1 out of 2 people over 85 will get Alzheimer's disease, 1 out of 2 people over 85 will not get Alzheimer's disease as well. And a couple of the other risk factors, in addition to age being number 1, the second highest risk factor for developing Alzheimer's disease is diabetes. Because there's a glucose metabolism problem in the brain with people with Alzheimer's disease. The third largest risk factor for developing Alzheimer's disease is some type of a brain injury or insult. So it could be a stroke, it could be a brain injury, typically one that leaves us unconscious. So those things are all risk factors as well. So while some things we can't help, and we certainly can't stop the aging clock, but we can reduce our risk of diabetes, and if we do have it, we can keep it well controlled. We can maintain our cholesterol in good control, and that reduces our risk of stroke or other head injury. So there are things that we can do, living a good, healthy lifestyle and reducing those risk factors. It's a great question.
So, I was looking here and I saw that at Albany Med, it's called the Ann and Leon Goldberg Alzheimer's Dementia Resource Program.
Right.
Wow. So who was Ann and Leon Goldberg, and do you know the story about this?
I do, because I had the very good fortune of working with Mr. Goldberg for a while.
Well, since this is a Jewish view, I figured they were Jewish. So.
Yes.
Jewish priest of Goldberg.
Yes. So Mr. Goldberg was a very, very dear and generous man, a former General Electric executive who took care of his wife, Ann, until she died of Alzheimer's disease in her 90s. And shortly after that, Mr. Goldberg set himself out in the capital region and said, I want to find a program that I can fund, a place where people with Alzheimer's disease can go for Alzheimer's-specific help. And so he named a branch of the Alzheimer's Center at Albany Medical Center in honor of his wife, Ann, and it was the Ann Goldberg Alzheimer's Resource Program, and that's actually the program that I started directing there. And then Mr. Goldberg passed away at the age of 102.
Wow.
After, in the first few years at the center, he came every quarter and met with me and to learn what we were doing each quarter and how we were spending these resources. And so after Mr. Goldberg passed, it became the Ann B. and Leon J. Goldberg Foundation. And now he continues to fund the program at Albany Medical Center, but the Goldberg Foundation also funds a very generous grant to the Alzheimer's Association and to some of our programs here as well. So he was an extraordinary man.
Are we allowed to ask what his bequest was to the Albany Med? I mean, was it 7 figures, 6 figures?
It was an annual gift, and so I know that a couple of years ago we celebrated that it had reached over the $1 million mark, his annual giving there. So it was very generous.
Over what period of time?
That would have been about over, I think, somewhere around 7 or 8 years.
Oh, wow. So it's over $100,000 a year.
Oh, well over.
Yeah. Wow. Well, so that was terrific. That's absolutely terrific. Well, that money goes a long way up here.
Right.
It wouldn't go as far down in New York City.
Right.
But up
it
here,
does go a long
goes
way
a long
here.
way.
It goes a very long way for us at the Alzheimer's Association, too. And one of the things that was very meaningful for Mr. Goldberg was the arts, and also engaging people with Alzheimer's disease early on. And so the initiative that we do with the Goldberg Foundation revenue is to engage people early in our programs and services. And then we have a Joy Tones chorus, that's people with Alzheimer's disease. Excuse me. And we have a painting group that we do and a writing group that we have for people with early Alzheimer's disease.
Wow. So the Joy Tones is the chorus that I heard when I went over to the Marriott.
You did.
And you had that, okay. Oh.
The Joy Tones started with 6 members, and now there are almost 30 members. And it's a chorus of people with Alzheimer's disease and their care partners. And they sing every week, and they sing at concerts around the Capital District.
Well, how
That's
does
interesting. I mean, how does that work? Because, I would think that someone with Alzheimer's can't even remember the words or the tones. How does...
Right. So you're thinking about later Alzheimer's disease in that circumstance. People that are diagnosed early are usually very capable. I had many patients when I was at Albany Med that still worked for a year or two with their Alzheimer's disease. So Alzheimer's disease starts with very modest memory problems and a little bit of language difficulty and then some mild personality changes. And it progresses over a series of years to those end-stage conditions that we see where people are totally dependent on their caregivers.
So when everyone says, "Oh, I'm getting old, I'm forgetful," I have to write everything down, or they have other techniques that they always put the same thing in the same place. Their keys when they come home, they put the keys in the same place, and they have all these techniques to help them along in life. But just because you're forgetful I don't want to scare everyone, doesn't mean that you have Alzheimer's or dementia or something else.
That's right. There are some differences in what we would consider normal aging memory and the memory loss that we should be nervous about. And so as we age normally, you're right, we need to remind ourselves a little bit more often, or sometimes we'll go out in the garage to get something, right? Forget what we went out there for. So surely we don't want everybody running to the doctor.
I did that yesterday.
Yeah, and we certainly don't want everyone running to the doctor every time they do that. And so what we say are, there are kind of two distinct features that separate that normal memory loss from the memory loss where we say, maybe we should go to the doctor. And the first one is that the memory, normal aging memory can often be cued back. And what I mean by cued back is, if you went out to the garage to get something yesterday, and you forgot what you went out there for, chances are when you went back in the house, you would say, oh, I needed the screwdriver. Right. And you'd go back in the garage and get the screwdriver.
Exactly what I do.
Right?
Right.
Because your memory was cued back. You saw something in your environment
right.
that reminded you of what you went out there for, so the memory returned. The other thing that's different is that when you and I forget little things, misplace our keys, it doesn't affect or significantly alter our day-to-day life, more specifically our functionality. So when memory loss becomes worrisome is when we begin to miss doctor's appointments, when we forget our children's birthday party.
Or when you're driving and you don't recognize the
You
stop
get lost.
sign, or you're saying, well, how did I get here? Where am I?
Right. So when it begins to interrupt day-to-day life. So little memory glitches, we expect those. Things that we can get cued right back, we expect those. But when we're no longer able to balance our checkbook, when we're missing doctor's appointments.
I could never balance my check. Don't even start with me on that one. Okay, go ahead, I'm sorry.
But oftentimes families will come and they'll say, my mother was never late with a bill a day in her life, and I stopped at the house the other day and there are 2 months worth of bills on the table.
Right.
That's not normal aging memory. There's something more to that. And so when we begin to see these problems, these worrisome things that interfere with day-to-day life, and also when we see people repeating stories over and over again as though they never told us the information, it's because they never stored it as data. And so they then tell the story over as though they never told you the story. So it has a different look to it. But again, in the early stage of Alzheimer's disease, people are very functional, and the early stage is the longest stage.
And how does someone get tested for this? Do they go to Albany Med and the Alzheimer's Center?
I think that's the best way.
Of course.
However, oftentimes the primary care doctor can be a good deal of help.
I mean, when you say, and actually I was going to ask this for the original Dr. Alzheimer, how did they test it? I mean, again, an autopsy, but and maybe he did it to Dr. Alzheimer also, but how would, a doctor know? I mean, just from your questioning, or is there a medical test?
Well, there's many medical tests. So first of all, you would conduct a pretty thorough evaluation. You would do an MRI just to make sure that there was nothing that could be altered. So let's say, for example, you did an MRI and you found a tumor. By removing the tumor, you may remove those symptoms of dementia. The same is true of something called normal pressure hydrocephalus, where we can go in, put a shunt in, and reverse the dementia. So there are sometimes cases where we can reverse things. So you want a scan so that you have a good photograph or picture of the brain. You want blood work to make sure that there's no metabolic insufficiencies. And then you do a neurological exam, which includes what we call a paper pencil or a neurological test. And that means, asking people a series of 30 questions and getting their responses and looking at those responses, measuring their ability to remember new data.
That's interesting.
And then the other thing that's so important, which is unique to Alzheimer's disease, the family's perception of how things are going are so important, because often we'll say to a person with Alzheimer's, how's your memory? And they'll say, fine, I'm just getting older. And the wife will be in the background saying, it's bad. It's bad. Things have changed, because the wife is observing it day in and day out. And so the family's notes are incredibly important when we're making the diagnosis.
Now, there's a whole other section to this where, as you move into the later stages of Alzheimer's, is the patient-caregiver-doctor relationship.
Absolutely.
And the caregiver are the ones who, again, I was going to say, even for the patient with Alzheimer's, it sounds like you're describing symptoms of depression. And that could bring you down and make you forget things. And, again, you're just not thinking, you're depressed, you're just not concentrating and focused on anything. So therefore, you think, oh, I may have Alzheimer's, but it might just be a byproduct of depression.
Right. You're right, Mark. In fact, there's an actual diagnosis called Pseudo Dementia, and that is what we see in people oftentimes who are depressed. If they're very, very depressed, they can appear as though they have dementia or Alzheimer's disease, and when you treat the depression, their cognition improves.
Now, the caregiver is really under a lot of strain and stress because quite often they're dealing with the generation that they brought into this world and the generation that brought them into this world.
Absolutely.
And they're, and it may be even another generation. Now we have great-great-grandparents, so talk about that because you have a lot of experience in that area too.
So you're right. Caregiving situations are very challenging ones. And they differ a lot. Sometimes caregiving situations are spouse to spouse, and that brings its set of challenges. So for example, if you have two people in their 80s and one has Alzheimer's and one doesn't, then it's fairly safe to think that there may be some other frailty. And this is an exhausting disease over the course of time. Early stage, not so much, but in the moderate stage, when someone needs help dressing and bathing and brushing their teeth and needing to be fed, it's a lot of work for an 80-year-old spouse to manage. So those caregivers have a challenge. Plus, as you alluded to earlier, and as Nancy Reagan always said, it's a very long goodbye. Because you watch this sort of backwards aging happen with your spouse, and that's a very difficult thing. The next set of caregivers that we so often see are adult children, which you alluded to. And for them, typically they're raising their own families, they're trying to care for their parents, they're often working. They really are, by definition, that sandwich generation that we talk so much about. And now we're finding more and more commonly, because these folks are working, that grandchildren are taking on many caregiving responsibilities in many households. And we find that oftentimes kids that are 15, 16, 17 years old aren't really equipped to be taking care of a grandparent or a parent with Alzheimer's disease.
Maturity.
Right.
I mean, it's all about maturity and being able to sort of manage your emotions.
Right.
Because the last thing you want to do is get so frustrated that you can't, that you lash out.
Sure.
And then we hear about elder abuse and all that, which is a problem.
Right.
So,
But, what about money, though? Because, people do work, like you say, they can't full-time. And I know a few people that, a rabbi say I should have an honorary degree as a social worker because I have to, people come to the clergy. And some people have, I know, given up everything to take care of their parents. Other people can't. Listen, you have to make a living.
Sure.
And then, money is money. You have a full-time person there that's,
right.
Not everybody can afford it.
Right, you are so right. And this is one of the things that the Alzheimer's Association exists to do, and that is help families of every and any economic means find the resources available to them. So for those people that have unlimited resources, there are certainly lots and lots of private options for them. For people who have more restricted resources, there are more affordable ways to secure care. So for example, if you had unlimited means, you might bring an aide into your home at a cost of about $20 an hour, let's say. But if your means were more restricted, one option for you might be an adult daycare program where you could send somebody for $30 or $40 and have a total day of care. So it's much more affordable. And then for those people that have very limited means, the Medicaid system does provide for a home care benefit now.
Now, let me tell you a personal story. My grandmother, may she rest in peace, passed away in 2000, and she was diagnosed with dementia in 1990.
Okay.
And I would be here in Albany, and I'd go down, and every time I went down to visit her,
New York City.
Yeah, down to Brooklyn, she would, like you said, the age would be reversing.
Sure.
And it got to the point where we celebrated her 90th birthday in 1995, and and we had a cake there. And just like a 2-year-old would do, she just put her hand in the cake and just took it, because that's what she wanted at that time was the cake, and she just put it in her mouth. I mean, she just had, again, the way you come into this world is the way you leave it.
That's right.
If you live a healthy, normal life. I mean, every year my grandmother would be taken to the doctor. He wouldn't make a house call, but she would be taken to, and the doctor would say, all her organs are terrific. It's just up here, right. And otherwise she's healthy and everything's good. But you lose your your ability to control yourself. Mm-hmm. You got to wear diapers. Mm-hmm. You have to. You can't feed yourself. Mm-hmm. You're in bed, crawled up like a fetal position. Right. I mean, it's just amazing. Like I said, and then you're just not knowing about silverware. Right. Like when you're in a high chair, you're just grabbing at food. Remember those days? Okay. No. And then
29 years since.
So we,
I have 13 kids.
Yeah.
So
it's a shame. It's not a joke.
That was something that I just experienced, and right. It was like, and then one day she just expired. Yeah. And that was it. Yeah. And I was just like, and it's interesting you mentioned about the Medicaid program. When she lived in her own, if she lived in the same apartment that my parents lived in, Medicaid wouldn't have covered it.
That's right.
So the apartment next door to my parents opened up, and they got the landlord to give it to my grandmother. So there was simply a door or a wall separating it. So she had 24/7 care, and my father would just go next door when he wanted to see her, and it was just a lot easier. But
so when she lived with your parents, she was in a multi-income family. Which is under the Medicaid law.
We realized that wasn't going to happen.
Right.
So my parents and my grandmother were 3 floors separate, and that was too far away for them.
Right.
So they wanted something closer.
Closer, of course.
And that's where they got that second apartment, just so that they could be right next door.
Right.
I mean, my father took wonderful care of my mother, and ironically, my father only outlived his mother by 5 years.
Oh gosh.
So my grandmother was 93 when she passed away. Wow. And it was just amazing how she was the heart and soul of the family.
Right.
And a lot of this went out when she passed, and then everyone who she was keeping together like glue all went their separate ways. Yeah. But, my father was just like, he didn't take a vacation. Right. It was very difficult for him to get away to come up to Albany to visit, or to go to Philadelphia for my brother, or when my brother lived in Boston. I mean, it was like you had to be there.
Oh, it's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
And the one time my father went to the doctor is when my grandmother passed away, and he wasn't with her at the last moment. Wow. And, but...
Is there, going back to the original, are they working at all met for a cure?
They're working all over the world for a cure. I think that, yes, absolutely.
Is cure the right word?
Cure, well, certainly cure is our vision, of course. But, so the first thing we need is more robust treatments. There are 5 medications approved by the FDA right now, and they slow down the progression of symptoms. But we don't have anything that alters the actual course of disease. So that's the first step. And then once you have a strong, robust medication, then you can develop a cure. And then eventually, when you've discovered a cure, you can discover preventions, actual preventions. Mm-hmm. So it's probably many years away. I regret to say I wish I had better news about something sooner, but certainly there has been no lack of effort, and certainly we're getting farther and further towards that vision every day.
I'm just saying that that there's a lot of money going there, because we have many people on our shows, and they have these unique diseases, if we say, and there's no money for it, but...
Yeah, well, definitely one of the things that's happened because of the long amount of time that people care for someone with Alzheimer's disease. So this year, for example, in the United States will spend $226 billion in caregiving costs, which is 1/4 of the defense budget for this country for this year.
Wow.
And so more and more government officials have realized that we can't afford not to find a cure for this disease. And so for that reason, they have added a significant amount of money to the research efforts.
Just even dollars and cents, it makes sense to get people
And
better.
this
That's
is
right.
this is
That's right,
public
Rabbi.
record because you're a not-for-profit 501c3.
Uh-huh.
So what's your fundraising and your goal, and how much, how many events do you put on? I mean, I think you had a gala.
We did have a
you know.
gala on Friday
Yes.
night.
Okay.
And
So,
we raised just over $100,000. Our goal every year our annual budget is just under $1 million. And some amount of that comes from grants, and some amount of it comes from what we call constituent events, which is our gala and our walks to end Alzheimer's disease. We have 5 of those.
Okay.
In addition, you attended our conference for
Yeah.
caregivers, which was wonderful to see you there. And we have 4 forums as well throughout our region. So we have a 17-county region. We go right up to the Canadian border and down through the Leatherstocking region. So that's the reason we have to do many things in many locales, because we can't expect folks with Alzheimer's disease to drive 3 hours to see us.
no, of course not. Yeah.
So we provide a lot of services throughout our region as well. So our fundraising goal every year is just about $600,000 a year, and then the rest we achieve in grants. And then, regrettably, our folks all pass away. As you know, this disease is a terminal one. And so we have countless families that have been so generous with what we call a bequest and memorial program. And families will often leave gifts or ask that gifts be made in honor of a loved one to the association. And just about 10% of our budget comes from the generosity of families that we've served over the years.
Wow. And how many staff people do you have?
We have 11 staff people,
Not even one for each county?
not even one for each county. So we
You need more staff? I'm
We
not
do.
applying, but
We
I'm just
do.
saying.
Yeah, we do, absolutely, because we're finding it hard to meet the needs. Believe it or not, the estimate is that about just over 60,000 people live in my 17 counties with Alzheimer's disease. So my staff alone, they are the most incredible group of people, but they can't do it alone with these numbers, just the
As a
sheer
number, I
numbers.
mean, we said at the beginning, because as the aging process is growing, and unfortunately, it's a good thing, but medical science has, people are living longer, and that's one of the biggest blessings in Judaism. You should live a long life till 120.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, there's a lot of care that has to be given.
That's right,
Is it,
perfectly
you having
said.
more and more people that are, we say 60,000, is that an increased number? Or
It is
you-
an increased number. It goes up every year, and happily, New York State has made a significant investment in respite services this year for people with Alzheimer's disease. In fact, it was very significant, $25 million a year for the next 2 years, and some amount of that will come to the Alzheimer's Association. So we're looking forward to actually adding 4 program staff to our team at the
Really?
association, which I'm thrilled about. All of this money will go toward programs and services.
Wow.
And I'm delighted to be able to add staff, particularly in my underserved regions.
Oh,
So
wow. That's
It's
great.
thrilling. We're
Well,
thrilled.
Much success to you.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
All right, only good things, and you
Thank
should
you,
do with
Rabbi.
health, and we should health for all your patients and the people that you work with, and again,
And their
continued
caregivers.
success.
Thank you so much. Thank
Okay.
you for having
Thank
me.
you for coming on.